So what is
Low budget.
Yeah, NTU.
Jesus. Actually, you're gonna pay for that.
I'm going to say it anyway, so it's nothing to do that. Like, right?
Yep. Alright, welcome to the Octofinals of NTU's Dorothy Cheung Debating Championship 2014. I'd like to congratulate both teams for breaking in what is NTU's training / bloodbath. I now invite the Prime Minister to begin this debate. Here.
Madam Speaker, we think the actions of militias in Crimea funded by Russia are morally reprehensible. And the fact that these militias have no one to hold to account, there's no one who can actually check the actions that they undertake, is something that's extremely dangerous. We respect on-site proposition, the rules of engagement in war, and believe that all war must be fought justly. For that, I have three arguments. Firstly, I want to talk to you about the rules of engagement. Secondly, I want to talk to you about why militia is bad, and then why are they bad, especially when they're covertly funded. And thirdly, talk to you about the efficacy of our policy and what we actually do on the international legal front, right? So firstly, the rules of engagement. Madam Speaker, we recognize that war is often a necessity, right? But we still recognize that there are some basic human principles that can never be violated in war. Things like the fact that you can never use rape as a means of offense. The fact that you can never use human shields or non-combatants in war. The fact that you can never use napalm or white phosphorus or Agent Orange or chemical weapons which have massive collateral damage to civilians. These are things we all protect under international law and prevent individual state actors from using these things and condemn them as war criminals when they do. There is an international mechanism to implement and prevent these from happening. You have war crime tribunals by the UN, and you have various international war crime tribunals like the one that's currently indicting like Slobodan Milosevic and Radovan Karadzic from the Serbian war, right? What militias do is completely evade this process of international accountability, and that's why my second and more important point comes in. Why are militias specifically bad? We say that militias are used only to evade all international condemnation and checks and balances which apply to prevent any abuse of individuals on the ground. So what are the things that militias actually do? Firstly, there's no accountability for their actions. These are often small individual groups with no international standing, and often aren't recognized on the international front, or don't have any buy-in into the international diplomatic arena. I.e., there's no way to pressure these militias, or usually countries which fund them detach themselves from these militias and don't take any responsibility from them. So what's the consequence of this lack of accountability? They often engage in extremely dangerous and heinous acts. The fact that the Hamas and Hezbollah store bombs in the houses of civilians. The fact that militias in Syria often use human shields to protect themselves. There is absolutely no accountability when it comes to holding these people to account, and they have massive collateral damage and things which are morally heinous. But the fact that these militias are often not trained for combat, Madam Speaker, means that they often cause far more collateral damage than normal trained armies would do. We think that in and of itself is a war crime, Madam Speaker. You see, the reason that you don't use chemical weapons or white phosphorus is because of that very reason. The collateral damage to unconsenting civilians on the ground, something that's very common. But fourthly, the fact that they never have court-martial laws, right? There are no court-martial courts for militias, and there are no consequences for their actions. That only aims to destabilize all nations, the nation that they go into at any cost. And that's something that we're not willing to defend. But fifthly, we think often post-conflict, these militias stay on or proliferate their weapons in the region, which causes tension for years to come. The fact that the US and the Soviet Empire and USSR funded the Afghan militias, and those weapons are still being used and proliferated in the region to cause tension. Many of those militias are staying on within those regions because they have nowhere to go after their countries have ditched them and want to take control of the region because they have the power and the men to do so. That's also dangerous under their paradigm. Before I go on, are there any points? Okay, so we already told you why militias are particularly bad. Why are they bad, especially when they're covert? Because we will say from side proposition that we will never use militias in any circumstance. But being covert makes them specifically bad, and we say that it should be a war crime. The first reason is it doesn't allow populations to understand why they're being attacked and what they can do to end the conflict. We think all populations, irrespective of their size or stature in the diplomatic community, have a right to know why they're being attacked and what they can do to solve it. Often countries, Madam Speaker, make trade-offs when they know they're losing a war, so they can sign a peace treaty and save as many lives as possible. When you're being attacked by militias, you have no idea who's either funding those militias in the first place, or who you can negotiate with, or what the claims of the militia even are, because there's no platform for them to express what they want to do. So that's the problem. You don't allow the attacked nation to ever know what they can do. You deprive themselves both of their ability to end the conflict as well as preemptively protect themselves by engaging their armies. We think that's a bad thing. Yes.
So if you think that all this militia essentially do fund, are you fundamentally against any sort of funding of political opposition on the ground?
Okay, there's a difference between political opposition in terms of having discourse in parliament and funding like rogue individuals with guns who kill civilians. There's a fundamental distinction, and that's something that you must agree from side opposition. But secondly, under the point of being covert, the fact that you're trying to dodge the international mechanism that already exists for wars is an admission of guilt on the fact that you want to do these things, that you want to be covert, that you want to hurt civilians, Madam Speaker. As insofar as the international mechanism already exists, your ability to, your intention to do this is already an admission of guilt and something that we believe we should engage in. But thirdly, what does our policy actually do? Because even if we aren't able to prove to you the principal justification of why this should be a war crime, we think the fact that our policy has efficacy in terms of a deterrent factor is something that's enough to win us this debate. We recognize that a lot of nations wouldn't give a damn, right? A lot of African nations in Central Africa or Iran wouldn't really care about international pressure or what war crimes actually mean, right? But that's true for any war crime, right? That's true for any international convention like the Geneva Convention. There are some countries which wouldn't opt into it. That doesn't mean the international community doesn't come out and condemn that and make laws on it. But we think our policy is efficacious in other aspects. Firstly, the fact that it's a war crime now means that you have a fact-finding mission or an international tribunal to investigate the actual things that happened on the ground. We think these international tribunals allow for a mechanism for that to happen. That's the first benefit under our paradigm. But secondly, we do think somewhere down the line, the fact that you will be charged with a war crime does inhibit even the worst of dictators from doing these actions. Why? There are often, the fact that you charge the war crime often comes in moral condemnation from the international community. You have things like travel bans, you have your assets frozen, you know that the moment you step out of your country, you will be arrested because there's an Interpol red collar notice on you and you will be sent to The Hague. That's a deterrent for dictators not to do this. And even if they still want to do this, it's far better in our paradigm under theirs. It's more likely that they're not going to do this in the first place. But the third and the more important class of countries who do this, right? They're not always autocracies or dictatorships. We've seen democratic countries like Russia, India, and Pakistan often fund these militias in Ukraine and in each other's countries. We think the fact that you often bring massive moral condemnation from the international community, which often manifests itself in terms of sanctions or travel bans or economic impact in the country, means that populations in the aggressing nations have the ability to pressure their leaders not to do these things, Madam Speaker. The fact that you will face international condemnation and people on the ground in your own country will be hurt because they can no longer transfer their assets or do business or import goods from another country means that it's likely that these people are going to change. But fourthly, another point on aggressor nation. We believe that if you want to engage in a conflict, we'd much rather you do it with your own soldiers. Why? Because we believe even aggressor nations should have an opt-in to the conflict, right? The fact that the US population is always keen to know where the US army is going and are concerned about the time that they spend in certain conflicts means that they're more likely to sign things like negotiations or end conflicts quickly because they also have buy-in into that conflict. Unlike militias, where you have no absolute buy-in from the population and can never democratically control the resources that you do, I'm extremely proud to propose.
Alright, I thank the Prime Minister to begin the case on the side of the opposition bench and guide the leader of the hearing.
Madam Speaker, we think that this debate does not just concern countries like Russia, it does not just concern countries that go in and perhaps attack other countries or try to prop up certain political oppositions for vested interests. We think this debate is much more than that. When we talk about covert funding, we also need to discuss what the general purpose of covert funding is and why any of these applications of these purposes are essentially illegitimate. Such government just wants to brand covert funding as well as something that's essentially violent and always creates a huge amount of harm. But this is essentially not true, right? Because you see, even in Russia, right, the entire idea of engagement in Russia in of itself wasn't that covert anyway. It was an explicit intervention, an explicit attempt by Russia to take back Crimea to defend the interests of the Crimean majority. We recognize that in Crimea that they have a majority Russian ethnicity. And the people there also cry out for Russia then to try to come back and defend their rights and interests. When you talk about war crimes, talk about the interests of the kind of violence that happens, you also talk about the purpose of war and talk about whether this is in fact senseless violence or whether this violence created is justified. Because let's face it, right? War crimes are essentially crimes in the context of war where violence happens anyway, where sometimes careless mistakes are made. But it's a question of whether all of these different actions taken were essentially excessive and unjustified. So at the end of the day, we see that even under the case of Russia, there is a case to be made that all of these actions were in fact in the interest of the people on the ground justified. This is why we go ahead to justify unilateral interventions. This is why international interventions are justified. But in telling you why covert funding is in of itself important before many of these different measures can be made. So secondly, so what Aditya really had to bring to the table was this entire idea that militias are ineffective. Sure, but we asked him the question then, why do we then prop up key rebel opposition forces on the ground who are mostly composed of untrained soldiers or people who actively need to protect their rights? Because we recognize it's a principal importance in helping to prop up all these people who are being harmed on the ground. That often in many of these countries, there's a power imbalance, and many of these people, despite them being untrained, despite the likelihood that they might incur some collateral damage, it is far more imperative for us to go and defend these people rather than condemn them and say, you are too careless the way you fight, we're not going to protect you, we're not going to defend your interests. At the end of the day, in terms of propping up people, in terms of giving either explicit or implicit funding, it is also important to consider the kind of stakeholders that are involved and the kind of the defense of all these different individuals. In so far that this funding actually promotes the saving of more lives and protects more interests of not only just the rebel opposition, but the general country as a whole, we think that any of this funding is essentially justified and can never then be considered as a war crime. Yes.
So even if you want to intervene, don't you think it's better to use your own military when you have the consent of your whole population, as well as an international mechanism to hold you to account for your war crimes?
Look, so this is a pronounced lack of nuance coming from side government, right? Because when we talk about covert funding, we're not just talking about unilateral interventions, we're talking about the kind of support, the kind of logistical support that's given to people on the ground. So today I have two substantives I'll talk about today. First, I'll tell you about what really constitutes a war crime and what the standards used when used to adjudicate what a war crime is. Secondly, I'll talk about the need for covert funding and the function and purpose it serves in the national conflicts. So before I go on, yes.
So you're saying that you'd rather fund these people logistically, right? But they're still going to do damage because they're untrained people who have weapons on the ground and no accountability. Don't you agree?
Wait for my substantive. So anyway, let's see what happens on the ground. So you see what usually happens on the ground is that many of these people, many of these key militias exist under violent autocracies and exist under dictatorships which enact huge senseless violence among them. So what happens then is many of these contexts, you have to look at the context of this debate, right? That violence is effectively commonplace in many of these countries, including countries like Syria and Libya and all of the different African dictatorships that do take place. So what we see here is that the power balance here is effectively skewed. What often happens on the ground is not that the militias are going around when wantonly killing people. What happens on the ground is that the governments are actively oppressing them, or they're killing off key rebel leaders. They are enacting huge, gross, inhumane torture on many of the key rebel people, and then there's a lot of senseless killing happening. Then essentially what happens on the ground is that these militia are essentially just common people. Your average farmer, your average trader, who is essentially untrained and forced to take up arms to defend his own interests. Why? Because the people in the international community do not yet have a consensus to help them. There's no one then, and there's no other international actor that can legitimately go in to help them yet, and all of these people then are being driven to take up arms, and these people are not combat ready, and yet forced to fight for their own rights. So what constitutes a war crime here then is that when this strong actor inflicts senseless violence on these people, like this, we think that a war crime is effectively often perpetrated by the dictators rather than people themselves. And when there's a level of legitimacy for the people to defend themselves and protect their own lives, then all of this violence is essentially not senseless violence, it's essentially justified violence as in any other kind of war, any other kind of war with a purpose. Because at the end of the day, what's banned under the Geneva Convention are the use of weapons that inflict excessive suffering, like biological weapons like Mitchell wanted to talk about, or pierce weapons that don't just kill the people, but pour out excessive amount of flesh and blood. So what happens here is that all of these different standards of what really is inhumane and what really constitutes crime in the context of war isn't the loss of lives or the careless loss of lives. What really happens here is the action involved creating massive purposeless violence on defenseless people who are unable to defend themselves, or defenseless people who are essentially not able to correct the counterbalance. End of the day, it's about this unjustified senseless torture that is duped to people on the ground, and we think that actually propping up these civilians to actually give themselves a decent fighting chance isn't exactly going to be war crimes anyway. So in and of itself, there's an explicit purpose for all these people to fight for their rights, that the kind of violence that essentially might be incurred on other fellow civilians as well, essentially justified. Because at the end of the day, what happens in this conflict is a zero-sum game. The violence is going to happen anyway, the governments are going to kill people, and in and of itself, sometimes to protect your own rights, it might just be justified to kill fellow civilians, especially when these civilians are propping up the very bad government that are oppressing you. So let's move on to the second substantive on the need for covert funding. Because at the end of the day, we see that the most important thing in many of these conflicts is the first responders, are the first aid that you need happen. When people in these rebel camps essentially don't have access to proper food and water, whereas they have proper access to logistical support. What happens then is many of these rebels essentially need all of this funding to sustain them long enough until international consensus can be made. Why? Because we see that the international decision-making calculus is usually very bureaucratic. When the UN, even to send a peacekeeping force to send in some aid, requires a lot of deliberation, and there's a lot of cock-blocking done by Russia and China, especially many of these dictatorships that they want to bring up. End of the day, we see that peacekeeping forces essentially are not very effective, not very efficient. Covert funding is extremely key for many of these different governments, or be it the US government, be it the EU, or even the other countries in the Middle East, to try to protect the interests of people on the ground, especially the Muslim minority or the Christian minority might exist there. At the end of the day, it's all about propping up these people so they can last long enough for international action to be done. At the end of the day, covert funding has to take place to serve the purpose to protect the people until any sort of explicit funding or explicit intervention can be made to protect them. We're very proud of those.
Thank you, Dorothy. Next question. No, but I made one. Right. I'm gonna lock the door because people are coming in and out. I just like to add to that because there have been people coming in and out. Okay, let it go. Right, I thank the leader of the opposition. I now invite the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the government case.
To clarify first and foremost, we don't like the idea of open funding of militias either, but it's not really the issue. I think that open funding is extremely different from covert funding, because while you prefer the ideal situation to be if you send in your own troops openly, or you send in international troops openly, because openness is the best way to create eventual roadmap for peace. At least for open funding, right? It's open on things like accountability, international scrutiny if you do things wrong. We see that with covert funding, there's never this mechanism of accountability. There's only the potential for distortional conflicts to an irrevocable stage. Now let's look at a few rebuttals before I begin on my substantive. First and foremost, on this whole idea of open deployment and how we are against supporting opposition, right? The issue is not things like the open deployment of troops in Russia at this point in time, but things like covert manipulation, things like placing your own militia in Ukraine, and then pretending that they are a threat so that Russia can then send its own troops under the pretext of defense. This is sort of deception that is going on right now, the use of covert funding of militias. And that is the problem with covert militias, right? That it can be used to distort the calculus of a conflict, to distort the way a conflict plays out. Furthermore, we don't think they ever deny the harmful characterization of how militias actually work out, that they are brought forth in a good part of this case. Things like how funding nations are detached, so not susceptible to things like international scrutiny. How militias are not trained for combat in a way that minimizes collateral damage. How they don't face things like court-martial and other legal consequences, so they're just out there to destabilize and they're not afraid to get away with with it. And furthermore, the fact that these militias are often composed of unsavory characters like past extremist combatants. So we don't see how all these harms are negated on their side. But even if we concede that the militias are just good men out there, good moral men trying to fight a just battle, right? We see a very huge problem on their part. Because if they're really that morally compelling a force, right, why are you afraid to keep it secret? And even if they're that objectively good, right, we don't think it is fair for you to not be held accountable to any international guidelines on what fair and just engagement in combat is. Furthermore, what we see, right, is that it is still unfair in nature no matter how moral you are, simply because the states being attacked, the sectors being attacked, do not know why you're coming to begin with. So there's no way for you to eventually chart negotiations or a roadmap to peace when there are combatants and sectors in there that you don't really know about. And why is it important to have this, right? Because we don't believe that characterization of some moral states and some immoral states. We realize that each state has its own selfish and self-interested agenda, because that's really how states work, right? Therefore, the own self-interested agenda of states funding private militias will overcome any imperative to be moral, as they put it. We therefore think it's dangerous. That is why we even need any international accountability in war. Last rebuttal on Eric's substantive. This idea of a humane way to resolve a conflict fast before any bureaucratic stuff hook it up, right? So firstly, they came out and told us nobody can help them but you. Before I go to that, I'll take a point.
Political interests aside, once you keep away the lifetime people have in the absence of open funding, are you then going to allow these people to die?
Okay, this is exactly my rebuttal, right? This assumption here that there's no other way to help the poor dying farmer who is forced to take up arms. Let's look at things like how NATO and other organizations are perfectly happy to send in troops when there's a need. They mention that there's a process of liberation, but that's precisely what we want, right? We don't want you to go around funding militias as you please because there are fast ways to effect your agenda. We need deliberation to make sure this is the best course of action that will eventually ensure the most peace in the region and cause the least amount of collateral damage and harm. But even if deliberation is bad, right, there's an argument for speeding up bureaucratic processes within international organizations that doesn't prove their point, but why private militias are so much better. And also, right now, to speed things up, we have things like coalitions of willing forces that go in without waiting for full consensus in international organizations. We therefore think there are still open and fair ways to stop this sort of harm being created. Also, we think it's very unfair. They're conflating things like humanitarian aid with sending in people to actually fight a conflict. So we think it's extremely unfair. We're still talking about violence and combat, but who is best justified to act in these cases. Furthermore, we don't think things are as moral as they paint it to be, right? We see the possibility of private militias, or covert militias, going completely out of control. What we see, right, is that, say in Syria, when you fund whichever faction you think is best, secretly, trying to push your own agendas in the war, your own idea of what is best for Syria. Let's see what's happening in the Syrian opposition. That creates things like infighting between different opposition factions with different fundings secretly from different areas. We also see that the minute you give guns to people, it is very hard for you to take that military capacity back. That is why you must be accountable about who you're funding, who you're sending in, and things like that. But then what we realize, right, if things are really that great, as I mentioned, you will have international support, you have democratic support back home. Therefore, you have the courage to send in your own targeted sanctions and your own men. We also realize that the roadmap to peace is entirely destroyed under their paradigm. It is impossible to finally engage the belligerents and sit them down for any dialogue when you have distorted conflicts in secret ways that people cannot talk about and think about and work out treaties to anymore. That is the problem on their side. Even if both of us want conflicts to end eventually and peace to be created, we therefore think they disrupt the process entirely. Moving down onto my case proper, I'm going to bring the debate to an international level and look at how it strengthens the international community's commitment towards ensuring fair rules of engagement. The problem today in many international organizations is that they're seen as being toothless, as not being very efficacious in regulating conflicts, right? We see they're trying to change that. We see recent attempts to prosecute people for war crimes or inhumane acts, but they're still being disrupted by one central problem, things like victimless justice, where victorious states or dominant states or economic superpowers are able to influence the proceedings and not allow full fairness. We also see how the modern complexity and multi-party element of conflicts, right, means that the standards set by, say, the ICC and so on are not fully able to meet this complexity or to ensure fair judgments across different ways of engaging in conflict, like private funding and so on. So what are we doing under our paradigm? We basically allow you to back out the effect of current disparate rules to make the ICC a far stronger regulator of war. Why? Because now we show a full legislative and principled commitment towards fairness in warfare, even when it doesn't suit developed states that dominate international organizations and talks on war relations and try to take the moral high ground. We now make it extremely clear there's a universal standard of openness and fairness in warfare that can never ever be violated, no matter who you are and what state you are. What then is the outcome? I think it changes the impression of international organizations. It gives them more support from all member states, because now people recognize that international organizations as the best way to arbitrate war conflicts. We therefore also see a greater willingness to provide for mechanisms to allow things like the ICC to work so much better. Things like being willing to be custody states for war criminals. Things like being willing to submit to the judgment. Things like being willing to respect the ICC and back up the investigation processes. We therefore think we are the efficacy of international communities to arbitrate and moderate international conflicts. For all those reasons, therefore, we believe they're the only ones that truly allow for fair engagement. I'm actually proud to propose.
Thank the Deputy Prime Minister. I now invite the Deputy Leader of the Opposition. Cheung.
Right. Come. Okay. Madam Speaker, this debate is not about sleeper terrorist cells that might be funded by the Middle East. This debate is not about egregious harms like human shields, etc., etc. This debate is about countries where democratic processes have systematically failed, or people have been systematically failed by their government. At the end of that, after every avenue has usually been explored, they resort to violence, or in retort to a government that oppresses them violently, Madam Speaker. We think that it is usually quite a high barrier for people to resort to such violence, given that they're putting their lives at risk. We don't think people take this very seriously. We think their characterization of Crimea doesn't really fit into this debate, because, well, if Russia was sending in their troops, it's to some extent the same thing as what you guys are proposing. As you're out of order, relax, calm down. What you were proposing, just too excited to heckle me today. What you were proposing as an alternative, right, military intervention. But I'm going to debunk that as well. First key contention in this debate, accountability. And I debunked this right about now. He told us that these militias are able to circumvent systematically any international law or any international check and balance that holds people accountable. We think this is false on a few levels. One, we think that organization equals efficiency. And this is what people essentially look at, like at the end of the day, right, in terms of these militia. The fact that they need to incentivize, other countries to fund them, right, means that they usually have an organized power structure, which is why to some extent, like these autocratic governments try and disable that, right, by killing rebel leaders. We think that there exists to some extent a chain of command. While it might not be military, we think that there do exist people who make the decisions and who take decisions on behalf of the militia, right, or who are spokespersons for that militia. We feel that there exists organizations, it's not a complete shambles as they were trying to say, which means that there are people and there are power structures in these militias, which is one of the reasons why they do get to some extent funding, right. We feel that in that scenario, meaning that given that you have people who are in a scenario where they have a say over what the militias goal or the militia's direction will be, means that you can hold those people accountable there. We don't think they're able to completely circumvent the ideas of international law in that scenario, right? Going ahead and you do go ahead and convict religious leaders or extremist leaders in Pakistan or in Afghanistan for that matter, right? We feel that even they represent to some extent the militia and in their ability to mobilize resources against the government or against foreign actors. We therefore feel that it's not completely unrealistic that you could go ahead and attack on that. Sit down. So, secondly, Madam Speaker, in the idea of this military intervention, they told us that Madam Speaker, that even if they concede this principle, they'd rather go ahead and unilaterally invade. We feel that in that scenario, the harms remain the same in terms of proliferation, whatever the word is, of weapons. We feel that in terms of creating much more animosity on the ground between different sects of religion or between the invading country and civilians on the ground, right? We feel that essentially, Madam Speaker, their alternate last-ditch solution of unilaterally invading is problematic. Because the only justification they gave is that it's important for the invading country's people to consent. One, we feel that it isn't always true that like people unilaterally consent to like war. We don't think that people are given that much power in a democracy. Take US for example. But secondly, we feel that these issues are often time sensitive when you and even if you were to go ahead and get consent with like contrasting interests or lobby groups like trying to put pressure on political actors, we feel that in that scenario, Madam Speaker, it often takes a lot of time to go ahead and do that. We feel that these invasions are time sensitive and need to be done in the moment or need to go ahead and give them funding. But more importantly, Madam Speaker, we feel that if political inclinations are aligned, i.e. that me as the US feels that this government is being autocratic and that we need to give these people some kind of avenue to strike back, or some kind of avenue to avenge or go ahead and at least even the scales to some extent, Madam Speaker. We feel that as long as these political inclinations are aligned, we don't think there's anything wrong with them funding these people overtly or covertly or even going ahead and invading it. We feel that more importantly, Madam Speaker, the huge cost to this country in terms of invading are much greater than covertly funding these militias. We therefore feel it's a much better alternative. Yeah, fine, go ahead.
The West funded the Free Syrian Army. Now there's massive fighting and influence of Islamic extremism, and you can't take their weapons back.
Yeah, so that's because of like auxiliary influences, right? When you have when you have like influx from other you have radical influx from other countries going ahead and joining the Free Syrian Army and going and polluting, right? Polluting that. We don't think that's in the control of the West, or that's any like the causally related to the funding in and of itself. We don't think that has any place in this debate. But more importantly, Madam Speaker, we think in terms of my substantive, why this funding essentially needs to be covert. And I think Rui characterized this for us well. The international organizations today, Madam Speaker, when you go the diplomatic route, are problematic because you have this massive like dick measuring contest between Russia and the US, right? When Russia goes ahead and vetoes more more Security Council regulations than anybody else. The fact that when Syria, when there was a huge deadlock internationally and publicly on the issue of whether Syria needs military intervention, we feel that when you overtly fund somebody and overtly declare your political intentions, the problem is it leads to a more global geopolitical standoff and more tensions globally in terms of diplomatic ties. We feel that's a big problem because essentially, Madam Speaker, countries then go ahead and as Rui mentioned, right, it's all about self-interest. Countries then go ahead and support actors based on like historical narratives or other geopolitical narratives rather than actually having actually looking at the interests of the civilians on the ground. Madam Speaker, at the end of the day, we feel that these people are embroiled in a civil war in most cases. We feel that it's slightly different when you have an invading country and rules of engagement and non-consenting civilians in that case. But Madam Speaker, more importantly, we feel that in such scenarios, when you have geopolitical or global intervention problematic because you have essentially like, a lot of animosity between the US and Russia, or in fact that most often not both contrasting or contrarian stances in terms of geopolitical issues, means that, Madam Speaker, the best way to go ahead and covertly fund them is the best way to go ahead and intervene in these countries and give these people a voice is to covertly fund them. Lastly, Madam Speaker, I just want to clarify something that was essential to our case. They told us that these arms are going to go ahead, that this money is going to go ahead and just that these people will use that money to go ahead and buy a truckload of bazookas and go ahead and use that against the government. We feel that there are other priorities in terms of providing, like mobilizing resources, incentivizing other people to join the movement, trying to publicize it to the international media, which has been clamped down, and trying to make their situation known. And most importantly, in terms of providing like basic medical aid in areas where other like international organizations might not be able to get there. We don't think it's unilaterally used. More importantly, it's very difficult in that international court to prove it's a war crime. Considering the fact that Hawala systems, etc., are used and it's usually not traceable to go ahead and use traceable. These funds are not traceable back to the actual person who funded them, or they use third-party actors to go ahead and do it, Madam Speaker. We think it's a huge burden of proof to prove that it's a war crime. Under state school, it's already a huge burden of proof to prove that somebody's committed a war crime. We think you made it even more difficult under your paradigm when it becomes about tracing the numbers. We're very proud to oppose.
So I will have prop up the chair at the door.
Yeah, sure. It's kind of distracting.
Very.
I don't think it'll work. Higher value 20. Funny.
I thank the Deputy Leader of the Opposition to close the substantive argument to the side of the government bench. I invite
I'm going to do 3 things in the speech, right? First, I'll take them on their best case scenario. We'll talk about the scenarios where they said it would be necessary and why we think even in those minute cases, it still causes more harm than good. The second thing I'm going to do is inspect the morality. We don't think we've heard much response from that side on what the rules of engagement of war are. And even if it is necessary, why that should be necessarily a moral thing that we should not condemn as the international community. So like efficacy, or even if you prove efficacy, you haven't proven why we should not condemn these people. Thirdly, I talk about the effects of our policy and why it creates like less fighting, less destabilizing, and why it's generally a practical policy even if you don't buy into our morality. Right? Is it necessary? Like we think there are two fundamental assumptions on our bench that we have to point out here. One, the fact that all militias are trying to help countries achieve certain goals and not like monopolizing power for themselves. But more perniciously, like they never ever told us in their two speeches why this funding has to be covert in the first place, right? Like you didn't hear one argument from them which told you why even if you have to fund militias, which by the way we're against, why it can't be done openly, why you can't at least hold that country to account for the kind of actions that are going on in that country. Like no analysis whatsoever as to why this has to be covert and why that is necessarily a thing that we should stand for. Right? But don't let them fool you that this debate is necessarily about saving lives, right? Because for the militias often never ever protect people or save lives. In fact, they cause more violence and more harm. If you really want to protect people, we have UN peacekeeping troops, which involve absolutely no like bureaucracy, right? The fact that they could be in Rwanda and Sierra Leone at the same time when two conflicts were happening simultaneously means that the UN always has like spare peacekeeping troops. Then what did they tell us in this debate? They told us we often don't have like consensus in the international community to intervene, hence we need to fund covert militias. Like bullshit. Even if you don't have international like the willingness of the international community, like think about the places we've intervened. Hardly ever have we had international consensus to intervene. That has never been something that's like stopped us from intervening, right? We often form like coalitions of the willing to intervene in places. Like in Mali, where France could intervene and had the resources to intervene, even though like you didn't have consensus in the international community that was particularly a good thing to do. But we could still hold France to account for the actions that went on there, Madam Speaker. That's the important point in this debate. Like the fact that even in Libya, when you had like the NATO willing to go in and like absolutely no bureaucracy and like being able to actually have a stable democratic government where you could have a check and balance on the militias that do operate on the ground, we think is necessarily a good thing. But they also didn't deal with the outcomes. Like even if you achieve your goal, which is overthrowing the dictator that rules that state, they still didn't tell us why the outcomes would be better on their paradigm, right? Because Aditya told you right from the first speech that it's likely that these weapons will proliferate in that region and destabilize that region further. Like you cannot possibly think of one simple example or case study where militias have done good, Madam Speaker, without any accountability. Look at Afghanistan, look at countries like Liberia, look at countries like Sierra Leone. They cannot simply point to even one example where we've had good outcomes without accountability, Madam Speaker. We think that says a lot. But more importantly, we think like they had no response to a couple of things, right? They said, oh well, these people actually have like command structures and there's like one guy in charge, hence they're accountable. No, they're not. Like we know who's in charge when they probably have like a spokesperson. That doesn't mean you can bloody court-martial them, right? Like that doesn't mean that person takes accountability for what his like subordinates do. For example, the fact that rape and torture is often used by militias can never be brought to justice because this person is not in the framework of the international community and can't be tried, Madam Speaker. We think we've got absolutely no response to that either. Before I go on, go.
Yeah, these militias often have an incentive to maintain the moral high ground in order to continue attracting funding. It means that they don't always engage in egregious harms towards the other party.
Bullshit. These countries are like often in war and you said they're normalized to violence. Like I don't think they have like any moral high ground to claim, right? The fact that the Syrian army is now indulging in things like cannibalism and even in Liberia where like warlords keep eating each other means that these people don't care about moral high grounds, right? That is precisely my point. They often just want to monopolize power and make sure that they're the next people in power. Often when we've like funded militias, that's exactly what's happened. Like you funded the Mujahideen in Afghanistan and look what we have here, guys. That is a horrible precedent to set. But the second thing I want to talk about is morality. Because let's be clear, Madam Speaker. This is a very minute part of the debate. Like, not in every case, in most cases, militias are not funded to protect people of a political opposition. Militias are funded by democratic governments like India, like Pakistan, to destabilize each other for geopolitical interests. What about that, guys? We've had no response whatsoever to that part of our case, which tells you that it is absolutely immoral to just fund militias covertly to destabilize other people. We haven't heard like responses to three moral arguments we made. One, that people of a population, even in war-torn regions or in democratic regions, have the right to know who's attacking them, Madam Speaker, so that they can make necessary trade-offs to end that violence. People are often willing to make huge trade-offs in the face of a military intervention. We think they have a right to know that, and that's why we support like rules of engagement of war, because you know who's attacking you and you can make those trade-offs. We've had no response from that side whatsoever. But second, we told you like court-martials are essential to make sure that you know what's happening in the war. Like, it's almost impossible to not commit any war crimes when you don't have any mechanism to hold these people to account. So like, even if it is efficient, guys, like even if you win that debate, you haven't won why it's moral to do this. You haven't won why the like ends justify the means in this debate, where you have the propensity to create like immense violence and cause immense harm, Madam Speaker. But third, we think the country who's like funding the militia has the right to know as well. They have the right to democratically consent to that intervention, right? Like, and Akhil says, oh no, actually, like, you don't consent to it because you vote in and some politician goes, yeah, like, that's democracy. Like, you don't have a referendum on every issue. That doesn't mean it's not democratic. It means that you have a right to like elect leaders who make those choices for you, Madam Speaker. That's not necessarily a good argument, and you necessarily have to have like discourse about that war before you go in. Third, we also told you why this will work, right? Because it's immensely easy for people to detect this. Like, it's immensely easy for us to see that Iran is funding Hamas, like wire transfers, where the weapons are made. It's much easier to like have an efficient policy where you can detect who's funding who and doesn't necessarily have to go into tedious trials. What does this mean? One, dictators often change their calculus, Madam Speaker. They wouldn't invade simply for a geopolitical, like strategic reason. So we at least like cancel those cases. But secondly, places like Russia where oligarchs have a lot of power. Like, if you freeze their assets and convict them of a war crime, they will pressure their governments to move out and not destabilize another country. We think that's a huge benefit on our side. Madam Speaker, in this debate, you have to weigh the two scenarios. The necessary like interventions that they told us about have an alternative, that is send your own military. But in the vast majority of cases, they haven't mitigated the harms which seem to be brought to the fore.
I think with this, we close the substantive half of the debate and invite the opposition. Here.
I'm going to be talking about three issues in my speech today. First, I'll be talking about the whole two paradigms, basically the idea of sending open troops versus our paradigm where we fund militias. Secondly, I'll be talking about why this funding is direly needed and why the use of that funding does not necessarily constitute a war crime. And lastly, I'll be talking about the whole idea of accountability and why it is not achieved under their paradigm either. So firstly, the idea of open troops versus funding militias. We think that despite SIPROC prefers sending in open troops while other nations are using outside troops like the UN. We think that when they say this, they recognize that there's an imperative needed to go in and intervene in these nations, meaning that they concede that things in these countries need to change. We think that there great harms exist when you use this paradigm to go and intervene in these nations. For example, harms of international standoff, meaning other different nations with different contexts pushing in their own side, meaning that all these nations have conflicted interests and will take sides based on their own geopolitical interests, such as like where they can get oil from or how they choose to intervene in these nations. Meaning that the kind of unilateral intervention that you require, that requires explicit agreement on all parts, doesn't really happen. Also because bureaucracy presents that people often veto against each other and do not ever come to a consensus on how they would like to go and intervene in these countries. Meanwhile, while all of this is happening, more violence is being escalated and and violence is being escalated in these countries. So what actually works, right? We think peacekeeping works, meaning funding the militias and ensuring that these people don't die, and ensuring that these political oppositions can stand long enough until a decision has been made. We think that the examples you gave of how covert operations lead to an escalation of violence are only examples where we found out afterwards that these operations were in fact covert. As long as these things remain covert, there is no escalation of violence. We think that when people find out who has supported who, you lead to an escalation of violence as the entire issue becomes a geopolitical issue. Before I move on.
Even if we assume that the only reason you would fund a private militia is to save lives, can you show us how these militias are actually effective in doing that and not increasing violence in those regions?
I'll go on to my second substantive. I'll answer that question in my second substantive. So we're talking about why these militias need money and why it does not necessarily constitute a war crime, right? So we see that there's a dire need for these militias to get this foreign funding. We think that the imperative lies within foreign nations to protect these militias who are being vehemently oppressed against their own government. Countries like Libya and Syria, where crimes are perpetuated by leaders and not civilians themselves, where these leaders are orchestrating the killings of key rebel leaders, and a great power imbalance exists between these leaders and between the civilians themselves. Meaning we see that, as my Prime Minister already outlined, meaning as my Leader of Opposition already outlined to you earlier, that these civilians are in fact compelled to take up arms and protect themselves, meaning that these taking up of arms is in fact a justified choice, because they need these arms to ensure their own safety and provide a lifeline for themselves. And we don't necessarily, and this is where I answer your query. The reason why we think that this will lead to an escalation of violence is because when we provide this funding, most of this funding is not via harmful weapons, but it is via logistical support, basically providing these militias with, for example, like food and basic defense to sustain themselves, to keep themselves alive long enough until a decision has been made within the nation that we live in. This is why we don't think it is a war of crime, right? We think that what a war of crime constitutes is a senseless, wanton violence for the sake of violence. For example, killing of hostages or unnecessary collateral damage. We don't think that these are the type of things that happen when you fund these militias, because what we are providing these militias when we fund them is a lifelong. We're not providing them with extremely harmful arms. We're just providing them with logistical support to last long enough and to sustain themselves until a decision has been. We cannot allow them to be attacked by their oppressive government and give them no fighting chance in the country that they live in, and let them stand by until we wait for international consensus to happen. We think that the need is for what we see here is a need for urgent action to be taken, and this is the way we can go about it. Now, before I move on,
Do you think that in warfare or any other international engagement, it's important to have checks and balances? So if anyone tries to be inhumane or unfair, they can be punished.
even if we need checks and balances, I'll go on to talk about why this checks and balances and accountability that you talk about doesn't really happen under your paradigm either, right? So we see that some extent of accountability can exist under a paradigm, as my deputy leader of opposition has told you, that people who fund them have a say on how this money is used and where this money is directed. We also tell you that the kind of accountability that you want is, for example, having these people tried in tribunals only exists under an international consensus. Meaning that when you try to achieve this kind of accountability, you need to do two things. You need to eliminate eliminate conflicted vested interests that different nations have, and secondly, you need international scrutiny on these nations. No nation is likely to concede to both of these issues. Meaning they will always have different interests when they go into making these kind of decisions, and they will not concede to having any kind of international scrutiny placed upon them. Meaning that this accountability will not exist under your paradigm because it is not something that is likely to happen. Meaning that the solution here is not unilateral unilateral intervention, because what you do under your paradigm is when you try and go ahead and drag out the process of trying to achieve this international consensus. What you do is you drag on the vested interests in every international actor. You only lead to an escalation of of more conflicted interests, and do not really address the problem issue that is at hand, which is that all of these people in this nation are being vehemently oppressed against and need to fight back against their leader. The other thing that you do is you perpetuate conflict in these countries, because now they're not being giving any fighting chance, no funding from any place whatsoever to fight back against the government, while you just sit and wait for international consensus to happen, which is very unlikely to happen for the reasons that we've outlined you. So what have I shown you in our speeches today? We've told you why these militias need funding, why it is imperative for them to have it, how they use it, and why it necessarily does not constitute war crime, and why this funding needs to be covert, because covert funding is what leads to a reduction in balance, and why their paradigm doesn't achieve accountability anyway. For all these reasons, very thoughtful.
I'm turning the opposition with, and now invite the opposition reply speaker to give 5 minutes.
Let's start out by scanning through what side government has told us in this video. First, they brought out the entire idea that militia are untrained and careless with violence. Essentially, it's a caricature of all these militia people as madmen dusting missiles everywhere, destroying structures, destroying cities, yada yada yada. They failed to deal with our counter-characterization of militia as, more reasonably, the average people on the ground who have not yet been given the appropriate support in terms of arms and all that. If we give you the explicit explanation on how this funding is usually meant as a lifeline for them, you don't really see how these missiles that they have is actually result and how these people can actually enact all that wanton violence. But given that, even if that was true, they bring about the idea of empowered militia killing so many people and killing all the other civilians just because they enjoy violence and blood. But then they bring us this very strange idea on how the solution then is unilateral intervention. I do not get this. We came to this debate as NTU C debate, and we thought that, NTU A would win and would allow them to go to finals. But given the kind of lousy characterization they give us, given this explicit contradiction they've given us, where they give all this analysis on all these unilateral actors coming in and taking sides, we gave the explicit analysis from Akio, from our speech, on how unilateral intervention effectively isn't the solution. Because when all these people take sides, this is when you have the empowered militia. This is when you have all the people in Syria, in Libya, and all these different forces getting all the missiles they need to kill other people. When you essentially empower both sides to perpetuate the conflict and create a prolonged conflict in the area, where you let all these vested interests come in and take place, that's when I tell you that explicit unilateral intervention gives them that exclusive edge and brings that exclusive harm. They never dealt with any of this analysis. And the only thing that Vaishnav had to say to this was that, oh, but they're not accountable. So what? You've never even proved how even on unilateral intervention on your side, any degree of accountability, where all these different actors have their own vested interests, and they have the interest to repeatedly veto all these resolutions in the UN. That is when you deny yourself for a truly transparent and accountable solution. This is something the SAC government has never refuted and deserves to lose its debate based on that. At the end of the day, when you bring about all these examples, the problem with Syria and Libya and Afghanistan, we've told you, is mostly because the problem really started, and everything really went to hell when all these international actors started their explicit interventions. They themselves considered that Russia going in was a problem, and Russia explicitly going in was a problem. The very idea of a covert intervention is that when you fund people no one knows. It's when you secretly fund people and give them that resources, like, hey, here's some food and water, here's some basic armory to help defend yourselves so they last through until either a unilateral intervention happens or until either an international action is enacted. We, as side opposition, are fundamentally opposed to all these unilateral interventions. We think that the only transparent and accountable solution that they want under their side only happens through peacekeeping forces, through where you eliminate all of this vested interest. So we gave you very explicit analysis on that. And the only response they had to that with covert funding was that, there's no transparency and there's no conflict. No shit, it's covert. And then the idea here that you have to tackle with right from the start is we told you, in the absence of international action, in the absence of international actors, it's a zero-sum game. The only thing that happens then is all the dictators having a disproportionate power and enacting senseless violence on this militia with no other means to defend themselves. This debate isn't about accountability at the end of the day. This debate is about war crimes. It's about senseless violence that's being enacted on the people, and whether preventing the senseless violence, preventing these people from dying, was essentially a justified cause. At the end of the day, when they talk about just war crimes and justification, they talk about how, oh, but this militia don't really save us. Bullshit. We are saving the militia's lives, right? We're saving the militia, who at the end of the day are average people, as they themselves have conceded. When they make all these principled concessions, we really don't think how they take and stand, because it essentially contradicts itself. The question of war crimes in this debate, what is a war crime, is that war crimes are violence without a justified cause, are excessive violence without a purpose, and insofar that senseless violence is being perpetuated in these areas, we think that we have explicit duty to try and ensure these people live, and in that self, the intent and that purpose can never then be a war crime. We're very proud to oppose.
Thank you, opposition whip. To close the debate, I invite the, opposition reply speaker, now invite the government. Here, here.
So let's start with a line that Eric mentioned in his reply speech. This debate is about accountability, it's about war crimes. Why do you say, if this debate is about war crimes, and it's all about accountability within warfare, we need to ensure basically in times of intentional conflict, how that basic human principles that we deem universal can still be upheld. And that's where the concept of war crimes comes in, right? Because it ensures accountability and openness during war, so we can hold people accountable when they violate these principles. We see how this is invaded by covert funding, simply because, as they say, you can't trace who is doing what, or hold them responsible for it, or punish them for it. The harms of this evasion were never dealt with. I'm going to cover three big issues today. Firstly, the principle of abhorrence of covert militias. Secondly, does it actually resolve violence? And thirdly, does it better international codes of war? So firstly, on why we think it's principally abhorrent to have covert militias set in. What we see, right, is that they try to tell us this good militia characterization to clash with our characterization of how covert militias can go so very wrong. We see a problem here in that they completely fail to respond to all of Aditya's logical links to justify our characterization of militias and their harms, right? Things like how there is no fear of any real consequences for inhuman acts, how finding nations are extremely detached in these cases, and furthermore, the types of people that join covert militias to begin with. We don't see any response, so our characterization still stands. All they came up with to try and compete that, say, no, we think that militias are really kind and human and all that. With no examples, no logic, we don't understand how that can stand against our characterization. Furthermore, we did try to engage it by telling you that if morality is truly absolute, right, why is it that different states have different definitions of what is best for, say, the conflict in Syria or any other conflict? And furthermore, if you are truly that morally compelling in sending in your militia, right, why are you scared to account to your people and to the international arena? I think that not only was that unanswered, Acuna came out and considered that by talking about how there could be so much outrage when you send in militias openly to begin with. Doesn't that show you that something is wrong? We think so. But all that doesn't matter, because no matter how kind your militia is, we still think there are very negative consequences to sending them in covertly. Our point is that first, it's unfair to states involved. Say in the Israel-Palestine conflict, if Iran is secretly funding militias, how do you resolve the conflict? How do you make headway? You don't even know who is exacerbating the conflict anymore. Furthermore, we realize, right, there is basically no checks and balances, so if anybody screws up in a conflict, we have no way to hold you accountable. Covert militias are also extremely open to exploitation. It is basically the best way to exploit militias for private agendas or to lose control due to exploitation by the sort of external actors that RQ did mention. This is precisely why it's criminal, right? Because you evade any international checks and balances scrutiny and you leave other combatants flying blind in what is essentially an unfair conflict. And let's move on then to my second point. Does it actually resolve the conflict? Then I'll just swing the debate, because we already proved to you why principally it should be a war crime, because ends do justify the means, but I'm going to go into it anyway. And this is the point where the opposition mischaracterization becomes extremely ludicrous. Because we are not really sending in, as they say, trained medical aid workers to comfort the sick and die, and bring them warm chicken soup or something, and maybe guns, but they don't really want to engage with that. But what we're really doing, right, is to send in fighters, arming people with guns to kill the factions that you want to defeat. It is basically a debate about war, right, not humanitarian aid. So that's precisely why the roadmap to peace and democracy is destroyed. Because now different actors, diverse and detached aims, now feed the conflict, and now you have a channel of violence you can never truly resolve. And you're not even sure the militias will obey you forever. You can't account for that. Moving on to my last point, does it better the international codes of war? I came out in my deputy speech and told you how it better strengthens international capacity to regulate conflicts, and it was completely dropped. And you know what really breaks the deputy's heart? When you drop my substantive. But it's alright, because basically they considered my stance with their deputy staff. They came and told you we are more efficacious, we sneak in so people like the UN can disapprove. That feeds into my substantive, right? That they are basically evading engagement and making supernatural bodies weaker than before in enforcing codes of law, therefore weakening any international capacity to regulate conflicts. For all those reasons, therefore, we believe that we truly characterize how covert militias work, why they're harmful, and why it's abhorrent and should be made criminal. For all those reasons, I'm extremely proud to report.
Thank you, speakers. We pass the floor to announce the results in the lecture hall.
Thank you.
Thank you.